Okay, good evening, friends. I'm so happy you're all here. And we have Michael Schatz with us today. Let me give a short introduction. Dr. Michael Schatz, fifth generation Philadelphian and veteran Jewish educator, offers tours and presentations about the fascinating and rich history of our community. He manages the Facebook page Philadelphia Jewish History Tours. Michael is an accomplished Jewish educator, currently the director of curriculum. Third? Did I make a mistake?
You're good. Keep going.
Okay. He's the director of curriculum and instruction at Har Zion Temple and the East Coast coordinator of Hebrew Helpers. A past national president of the Jewish Educators Assembly, he holds bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in education and Jewish studies from Vassar College, Arcadia University, Gratz College, and the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. The presentation actually had two parts. The second part was going to be in April. However, under current situation, we are going to postpone it to next year. And this year we will do only the Zoom part. So Michael, we are ready for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me and welcoming me to your community at Ohev Shalom. And I didn't have to travel even, the 10 miles up 2nd Street Pike from my house to be with you. So, but although I would be happy to in the future. And as Sarah said, we'll make a plan. I hope when this pandemic is over to do a tour and to go out and see the great sites that there are to see in Philadelphia about Jewish history. So I have a PowerPoint, I share slides, I have pictures, I tell some stories. Just my background quickly before I turn that on. And thank you, Sarah, for that very thoughtful bio. It's always a little bit embarrassing to hear people, saying nice things about you, but my dad would be proud. So I've always been interested in Jewish history and in Philadelphia and in history in general, but the closer the history is to me, the more I was interested in it. So there you go. As Sarah said, fifth generation in Philadelphia. My great-grandparents all came here. Even some great-great-grandparents came from Europe to Philadelphia, and my parents and raised us here, and we raised our kids. And so I'm a proud 5th-generation Philadelphian. And as a kid, my parents would take us driving into the city and into town. We'd pass along Broad Street. They would say, oh, that used to be Beth Sholem. That's where AJ used to be. And I was always very interested in, where they came from and their parents and sort of the story of Philadelphia's Jewish history. So as I learned more as an adult, I was able to put together this program, and I hope that you'll enjoy. So my family came from different neighborhoods in different places. So I sometimes talk about them within the context of my talks. And when we do walking tours, if we go into the Jewish Quarter or the area around 4th and Lombard, which we're going to see some pictures of, I point out the house on South 3rd Street that my great-grandfather's uncle lived in 1899 as a boarder or something when he first came to this country. He came even before my great-grandfather came because his uncle was already here. And I think that's pretty amazing. 120 years later, you can still see that house. So I'm going to share my slides now, my PowerPoint, and we'll take a little trip. Let's see. All right, you should be able to see that pretty well. History of Jewish Philadelphia from 1740 to the present. So we're going to kind of fly through because it's a lot, and you can't do it all in an hour. So we're going to get some highlights, but we'll try to cover a little bit of all of the different periods. And there's my card. The backdrop of the card is one of my favorite buildings, synagogue buildings in Philadelphia. That's the Vilna congregation on Pine Street in Society Hill. And I think we're going to see it a little bit in a few minutes. So Philadelphia, this is the map, as you know, what it looks like. And in 1740, this was a county maybe, or in the colonies, but the city of Philadelphia is what's today's Center City, right? If you can see my cursor right here. That was the whole city. Everything else was farms and villages. And the Jews, not just the Jews, but all the people lived basically along the river. We go to William Penn's map that you may have seen, that checkerboard map that was laid out by his surveyor, Thomas Wynne, in the 1680s. His design was this checkerboard grid that was replicated all around the country at later times, but it was Penn's design. So the Schuylkill River is on the left side, this Delaware River is on the right side, and the north-south streets all have numbers. The east-west streets were named for trees. And basically the whole city was walkable to the river in the first century or so of its existence. And the Jews lived with, the few Jews who were here lived with basically everybody else in those blocks closest to the river. There were 5 colonial Jewish communities. Here we go. And these were communities made up of Sephardi, Spanish, and Portuguese Jews who had left Spain and Portugal and gone to London and Amsterdam, and some to the Caribbean and some to South America. In 1624, I don't have that date in front of me, but something like that. The very first Jews that stayed came from South America when the Inquisition came to Brazil and fled to New York City. They got permission from the governor at the time, Peter Stuyvesant, and the Dutch East India Company to reside in New Amsterdam, which was then later New York City. I don't know why they give the date of 1730. That could be when the first building was built or something, but the community is older than that. So aside from New York and Philadelphia, we have the community in Newport, Rhode Island. We have Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. These others are a little bit later post-revolution, but those 5 are the colonial Jewish communities. And the original community was based on a cemetery purchase in the upper right corner. That cemetery still exists and you can visit it. We often start our tours there. It's on Spruce Street between 8th and 9th, across the street from one of the entrances to Pennsylvania Hospital. A Jewish merchant in Philadelphia named Nathan Levy had a child who sadly passed away, and he got permission from the government of the colony to buy a burial plot for his child. And that burial plot was expanded and became the cemetery that was the basis of the community that grew into the Mikveh Israel congregation. And Philadelphia, as in the other colonial Jewish communities, the synagogue was the community. Everything happened through the synagogue, whether it was Jewish education, support for the poor and the travelers, kosher supervision and slaughter, and brit milah, and worship, of course, and anything that had to do with Jewish life was through the synagogue. So this on the upper left is the first building of Mikveh Israel, dates to about the 1780s. And their second building was built on the same spot, this middle section they called it the Egyptian Revival style. You can kind of see that pyramid shape. It looks a little bit like it came out of the Prince of Egypt or something. And that's on Cherry Street, which is a small block in between Race and Vine Street, or is it between Arch and Race? Between Arch and Race, yes. And between 3rd and 4th Street. Neither building stands any longer, but there is a plaque on that street. And if you are familiar, Mikveh Israel still exists as a congregation. It moved again a couple more times. We may see some later pictures. And in the night, oops, there's one now, but we'll come back to that. In 1976, in the bicentennial, the congregation moved back to about a block away from its original building, where it stands today, right on Independence Mall on 5th Street at Market. So that's, and the other unique and important thing to know about Mikveh Israel And similarly, the congregation in New York, which is called Shearith Israel, or the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, is they maintain the Western Sephardi Spanish and Portuguese minhag, or tradition, that they've had for hundreds of years. And it's in common with London and Amsterdam, not so much the Eastern Sephardi communities along in North Africa and the Middle East, but the Western Sephardi tradition with the melodies and the order of prayers and certain things about their rituals and traditions are really unchanged in 270 or so years. It's quite remarkable. So here's the third building of Mikveh Israel. They moved a few blocks north or west rather to 7th and Arch Street. And this building style with the arched windows and the symmetry and the stairs is something that we'll see replicated in other 19th century synagogues and buildings. So this is built, dates to 1860. And you can see an interior picture, and some of these interior elements they still have. This platform, the bima, or they call it the teba in the Sephardi tradition, it still stands. And they picked it up as marble or something like marble, some kind of stone, and they moved it to their subsequent buildings, and they have it now on 5th Street. You can imagine it was quite an impressive interior at the time. Unfortunately, it doesn't stand any longer. So that's the Spanish and Portuguese, but pretty soon the Sephardi Jews were eclipsed by German-speaking Jews. Even by the time of the revolution, it's likely that more members of Mikveh Israel were German than were actually Sephardi, although they got to Mikveh Israel and they said, oh, that's how they do things around here, and they acclimated to the Sephardi customs. Philadelphia becomes the first city in the New World to have a second synagogue, and where we said that the community was coterminous with the synagogue and everything happened through there. By 1795, Philadelphia has a second congregation. It divides along kind of ethnic or heritage lines. So there's an Ashkenaz synagogue. Though, as I said, most members of Mikveh Israel are probably German speaking and Ashkenaz. Newer arrivals that wanted a synagogue with Ashkenaz ritual started Rodef Shalom. Now, this picture on the lower left was not their building from 1795. Rodef Shalom doesn't have a permanent home for their first 60 or so years, but this is a Frank Furness building on Broad Street at Green, right where Rodef Shalom stands today, in a different building. That seems to be a theme, and it keeps coming up where a synagogue will like its location, but need a new building, tear one down and build something else on its spot. We also have another tradition of moving further and further out from the core of the city, which we'll talk about as well. These are some of the other 19th century German congregations. They all have great stories, but we're going to kind of fly through it so we can get to the Russian immigration and the other neighborhoods. So this is the Mikveh Israel on the upper left that we saw just a moment ago. The third synagogue at Rodef Shalom, though, as I said, that's not their original building. The top middle is a drawing. It's not great, but that is Beth Israel. That's the third congregation, founded in 1840. And Beth Israel was somewhere in the northwest part of Center City, around 7th and Race. They moved into North Philadelphia. They then moved to Strawberry Mansion. We'll see some pictures of that a little bit later. And today they're part of the Rittenhouse Square congregation called Beth Zion Beth Israel. Its Beth Israel heritage dates from 1840, the third congregation. This large picture in the middle, at bottom, also a drawing, is a few buildings ago, Knesset Israel. They have a second synagogue, which we'll see in a few minutes, that they built on Broad Street in the 1890s. This one dates from about the 1860s, and it's at 6th and Brown Street in Northern Liberties. And on the right side, this red building is really one of my favorites in all of Philadelphia. This building still stands, and it's the oldest building built as a synagogue that still stands in Philadelphia. It was built by Adith Jeshurun, AJ, in the local parlance, in about 1886. And it's on 7th Street, just north of Cecil B. Moore Avenue, which used to be called Columbia Avenue. So when when old time AJers talk about the old synagogue, old one, they say 7th and Columbia, and they mean this building. AJ sold it in 1910 and moved to Broad Street. We'll see that in a few minutes. And it was sold to an Orthodox synagogue called Ohel Jacob, who remained there until the 1960s. They then moved to the Northeast. Some people may have heard of Ohel Jacob from their days on Castor Avenue. But they started out by buying Adith Jeshurun's building in North Philadelphia. All right, we're going to move on and we're going to loop back when we talk about the Russian immigrants, and we know that the date of 1882 is a really significant date in American Jewish history. That is the date that we attribute to the beginning of the mass migrations of Eastern European Jews, although there were Eastern European Jews coming to America before that in some smaller numbers, and some scholars, Hasia Diner in particular, if that name is meaningful to you, contends that the whole 19th century is a story of merchant peddler Jewish immigrants, and the German and Hungarian and Polish and Russian and Romanian was all part of the same wave. Other scholars kind of talk about the German wave and later the Russian wave. You can use your judgment. So by the 1890s, what we call the German Jews had become more Americanized, wealthier, middle or upper middle class. They moved from the Northern Liberties neighborhood to Broad Street, which was the grand boulevard of the Jewish community, where they built these very massive and impressive temples, as they were then called. We'll start with the upper left is actually not Broad Street. This is Beth Israel's Strawberry Mansion building. It's at 31st or 32nd and Montgomery Avenue. It's somewhat about a mile and a half west of Broad Street. And we'll talk about Strawberry Mansion a little bit later. Before the masses of second generation Russian Jews came to Strawberry Mansion, there were German Jews, and this was their synagogue. You can kind of see peeking out of the top a dome. And I've seen interior pictures. It was quite impressive looking. I have not been inside, and last I heard, that building might be in the process of being torn down, which is very sad. And I was sorry to hear that because it was quite grand and impressive. I haven't been by lately to see, so we'll check. The bottom left is Knesset Israel, KI's building on Broad Street. At the time in the 1890s through the 1920s or 30s, it was the largest and one of the most prominent Reform synagogues, not just in Philadelphia, but in the country. They built this very grand building with 3 towers right on Broad Street where the Temple Law School today stands. That building had a fire and no longer stands, but right next door, the picture that you see with the flag in front here, they called the Alumni Building. It was an auxiliary building that Knesset Israel built, and that building still stands. It's Rock Hall. It's the College of Music at Temple. This third from the left building was AJ, Adith Jeshurun's Broad Street building. That was at Broad and Diamond Streets, so just slightly north of the university. And that was their building from 1910 until the 1960s. And all the way on the right, that's Mikveh Israel's 4th building on Broad Street at York Street. Building still stands. Until a few years ago, it was a clothing store owned by Israelis, of all the things. They sold jeans and sneakers and that kind of thing. And I was inside. There were still some features from when it was the synagogue. You could see where the ark was. You could see the various archways and galleries and so forth. It was really quite a beautiful building, Mikveh Israel on Broad Street. It shared a campus with Dropsy College and with Gratz College. From the early 1900s, this concept of Jewish community campus already was taking hold at Broad and York Street. And those colleges were really founded by leadership and members of Mikveh Israel, the kind of the mother congregation of the Philadelphia Jewish community. And as we said earlier, that congregation remained at Broad and York Street until the bicentennial, when they were able to move back in town. These other synagogues, as you probably have heard, moved in the mid 20th century, moved to Elkins Park, following that wave of German Jews, although their membership probably had become more mixed with later arriving Eastern European Jews and their descendants. They moved into Elkins Park in the 1950s and 60s. The top right is Rodef Shalom's current building, which is thriving and open and beautiful, and you can visit it today. I've taken tour groups through there. In addition to this grand temple building at Broad and Green Street that they built in 1928 to replace that Frank Furness building, they added a massive wing just to the south of the building. It would be to the right of this on this picture. I don't think you can't see it here. This picture may predate that addition, but it's still really like a flagship Reform congregation, the only Reform congregation in the city itself of Philadelphia, and certainly in Center City. And as the Center City has grown with both young people and retirees who gravitating towards Center City and in expanding what Center City means geographically, even the congregation has flourished. So I wanted to share that with you. And let's get moving on to the Russian Jewish immigrants, because I don't know, I find that pretty interesting. Here we go. So this is a picture of South 4th Street. 1882, we give as this date, there were a series of pogroms following an assassination attempt on the Tsar at the time. And between the anti-Semitism and the poverty and the economic opportunities in the Western world, particularly the United States, but also in England and Canada, in France and Central Europe, Jews began migrating westward, overwhelmingly to the United States and overwhelmingly to New York. New York goes from something like 80,000 to over 2 million Jews by the 1920s. Philadelphia is a distant second city. We go from about 12,000 Jews after the Civil War to about 200,000 in the World War I era. There are three main sections of Jewish immigrants in Philadelphia. The largest and most prominent and most popular, well-known, is what's called the Jewish Quarter. And that's the area around 4th and South Street. It's actually a little bit wider than that. It's the area from 2nd Street on the east to 6th Street or so on the west, and from Spruce Street, which is really in Society Hill on the north, to Washington Avenue on the south. And when we do walking tours, the northern part is Society Hill, the southern part is Queen Village, but the whole area was known for a good period from the 1880s through the 1940s as the Jewish Quarter. This is a picture of South 4th Street, and you can see these buildings that still stand. You can see there's a delicatessen, there's push carts standing in front. So people would sell their wares on a push cart. If they got a little more capital and were able to rent a store, they would move inside to a store. They might have lived upstairs. They might have taken a boarder. And when we hear stories of New York's Lower East Side, well, this was Philadelphia's version. It was very close to the river. So right, 2nd Street, then Front Street, then Delaware Avenue, then the river, right? So people could get off the ship at Washington Avenue Port, and they could really walk right into that Jewish Quarter area. Others came through Ellis Island. I know my ancestors mostly came through Ellis Island, and then they took a train to Philadelphia because for whatever reason, the family got a start here. By this point, the German Jews, as we said in Philadelphia, had moved kind of north along Broad Street, and other German Jews had kind of spread out across the country. So we have growth of cities like Cincinnati and St. Louis and San Francisco and really all over the country. The Russian Jews do spread, but they really stay for the first couple generations on the East Coast, particularly New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, also Chicago. And it's not until somewhat of a later period that we have this migration to the Sun Belt, to Florida, of course, and to the Southwest and California. We're going to focus on Philadelphia. So here's some, so this map is a map from the 1930s. It was made by the mortgage industry, commissioned and made by a man named Brewer. And it's really redlining, if we want to get a little bit political. It had to do with who could get a mortgage and who couldn't get a mortgage. And they made this map. It's a little bit hard to read, but you can get the outline of the city of Philadelphia, right? Cheltenham Avenue here, City Line Avenue here, the Northeast, and Center City is over here. So the colors, and we're going to see some closer ups a little bit later, the colors are where the mortgage industry told us certain undesirable people might have lived, right? So on this map, that the red color is industrial. So that's not people anyway. The pink color is African American, although they had less polite terms in those days for who that was. The green, you can see in like in the South Philadelphia area, kind of the western part of South Philadelphia, little pocket over here in West Philly. That's Italian. And blue is guess who, right? Blue is us. And what's fascinating to me about this map is you can look at this, and if you dismiss the political overtones, you can say, look, in 1934, these were Jewish neighborhoods, and they kind of remained through the 50s, because with the Depression and the war, people didn't move so much. And then we have the urban crisis in the 50s and the riots in the 60s that Jews started to leave. But for a couple of decades and more than one generation, we have South Philadelphia here, right? From basically 2nd Street to about 8th. You can see how there's pretty firm borders, was the Jewish part of South Philadelphia. We have that Marshall Street area up here. So we go from about Spring Garden or so up to about Montgomery Avenue, but very narrow from like 5th to 9th Street. Here along the Fairmount Park is Strawberry Mansion, right? Up in here we have Logan, and we have Feltonville, which was the neighborhood my mother's family came from. We have smaller pockets in West Oak Lane, and then we have some sections of West Philadelphia. We have Parkside and Winfield, and then the Cobbs Creek neighborhood. So we're going to take a look at some of these. We can't do them all. We'll just run out of time, but that's the overview of the Brewer's map. All right. So there's 3 immigrant Jewish neighborhoods. The first one is called Jewtown. Very obscure. Not a lot of people have heard of Jewtown. My dad actually came from Jewtown. It was a small pocket in Port Richmond that was a little Jewish area in the middle of a mostly Polish neighborhood. And this was one of the 2 synagogues that stood across the street. This one still stands, the other synagogue in Jewtown. It dates from actually before 1882. There were the beginnings of Jews in the 1870s came to Philadelphia, and for whatever reason, they didn't live with the German Jews. They were, Polish and Russian and Lithuanian immigrants. They found their own neighborhood somewhat out of the middle of the city, and the neighborhood became known as Jewtown. There was an article in the WHYY did that you can find on the internet that someone went back as a reporter recently. Now, there haven't been Jews in this neighborhood in 50 years, but the people who live there still call it Jewtown, and they probably don't even know why. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to quickly move through. This is another, just a residential and commercial street, Williams Street, it was called in Jewtown. But let's move to the Jewish quarter. So this is a blow up of that Brewer map. So you can, by the 1930s, when they made the map, already the Jews were moving out of the Jewish quarter, right? We gave 1882 as the beginning of immigration. 1924 is really when we talk about the end of the Great Immigration. There were restrictive laws and quotas placed to favor Northern Europeans and disfavor Italians, Slavs, and Jews from entering the United States. So while the 1880 immigrants moved along to other neighborhoods, new immigrants kept coming, right, and filling the Jewish quarter. But by the 1930s, new immigrants aren't coming. Older people are remaining. It's still the kind of the middle of the Jewish institutional community, and we're going to see some examples. But the Jews have moved south along trolley lines into South Philly and into Strawberry Mansion and other places. But you can see the hash mark blue. It's not as heavily Jewish as it had been, but it's still pretty Jewish. From here we go at 2nd Street, and here we are at 6th, and you can see the line. Look, all of a sudden you cross 6th Street and it's Italian, right? And if you go a little bit north, when you go above South Street in the area around Lombard or so, when you cross 6th, it's African American. So the lines are pretty firm. Let's see some examples. This is that Vilna Shul that is on my card. Still stands at 5th and Pine. In fact, it's a Chabad congregation, but they're rebuilding this building to house a mikveh. So it's part of the resurgence of the Center City Jewish community. So this is the kind of the grand synagogue of the Jewish quarter. B'nai Abraham also still stands, still operates. It's run by Chabad, has a nursery school, young people coming back over the last couple of decades. And there were so many synagogues in the Jewish quarter that are gone, but there are a few that remain. So the first, let's talk about it just for a minute. The first Jews, Eastern European Jews who come to America, the first thing they do is find each other, right? So they find their friends from their old neighborhood, from their old shtetl, and they form these societies. In Philadelphia, they called it a Verein. You might have heard that word from your grandparents. And in New York, they called it a Landsmannschaft, or a landsman's society organization. So these societies would have a meeting, they would raise money and maybe send over to help their townsmen in the old country. They would lend to each other to start a business or whatever. They very often had a burial society. So they would buy a plot for the Volozhiner society in the Har Yehuda cemetery, so that they would all have their plot together, for example. And sometimes they started a shul, but not every time. So you have Landsman shuls. There's the Nesner shul. There's the Anshe Zatomer shul. There's the Anshe whatever little shtetl shul. Sometimes they often were in a row house or in somebody's storefront. But in the Jewish quarter, in the larger concentrated neighborhoods, a few of the societies might get together and form a bigger synagogue. So the B'nai Abraham was called the Russian synagogue, right? The Russische Shul. So Jews from all parts of Russia might feel comfortable with the service here and would be welcome to join and to pray in B'nai Abraham. So they bought a former church on this property on Lombard Street. They outgrew it, and by 1910 built this building. So remember I said that AJ building on 7th Street was the oldest synagogue building standing in Philadelphia. So B'nai Abraham is the oldest synagogue that's still a synagogue standing in Philadelphia. And it's after the Jewish quarter kind of declines, and then really by the 60s, the immigrants are mostly gone, and some urban pioneers are coming back, which we'll talk about in a minute. B'nai Abraham kind of hobbles along and remains, and Lubavitch Chabad kind of rescued them, and it's been refurbished. It's quite a beautiful building inside. I think we might have, here we go. Here's some interior pictures. This is the rabbi today, Rabbi Goldman, and you can see the balcony and the rose window, and it's a pretty beautiful building inside. So we'll move on. So this is the dedication in 1910. You can see it had an onion dome on top, and you can see that it doesn't have an onion dome anymore. That was a very popular style. So they called it the Moorish style, and many synagogues and probably some churches were built with that onion dome. And unfortunately, they were wood, and they were not really fire protected very well, and a lot of them are gone. So the longtime rabbi of B'nai Abraham was a rabbi named Bernard Leventhal. He wasn't just the rabbi of B'nai Abraham, but he was really the head Orthodox rabbi of all of Philadelphia for a period of 60 years. It's quite a remarkable accomplishment. And his efforts really set the pattern for many, many things in Philadelphia. He started the Talmud Torah. He was an ardent Zionist and was involved in all kinds of Zionist causes. He was involved in Yeshiva University. He was really a very significant leader in all of American Judaism. But that was his main gig, was to be the rabbi of B'nai Abraham. So this is another of the Jewish quarter synagogues. Today it's called Society Hill Synagogue. When it opened, it purchased a former church and went through a couple of short-term iterations, but it spent most of its life as known as the Romanian American congregation. And if you can read this is not a bad picture, you can read the Hebrew, where it's actually Yiddish above the door. It said, the Greisa Romainische Shul, the Great Romanian Synagogue. So it's operated by a different congregation today. Society Hill Synagogue purchased the building in the 1960s as the Romanian congregation was kind of going under and going out, but the building remains a synagogue on Spruce Street. This is the third of the really great Jewish quarter synagogues. It's called Kesher Israel. It's also a Russian synagogue from a similar period to B'nai Abraham. They didn't build the building. It was a former church, and the interior is much more impressive than the outside. You can see that I think it's pretty beautiful. When the synagogue bought it, they added the balcony that wasn't there originally, and it was restored maybe 25 or so years ago with a new ceiling and refurbished benches and pews and so forth. And this behind the ark looks like marble, but it's actually trompe l'oeil painted wood to look like marble. And we've seen that's in B'nai Abraham as well. So that's Kesher Israel. It's a functioning synagogue. It's a conservative synagogue. It has a Hebrew school and a nursery school, and it's the place that we've been able to take tours when pre-COVID times when we were allowed inside. Other things in the Jewish quarter, the Central Talmud Torah building still stands on Catherine Street. And here's some different businesses in the Jewish quarter. Yours Romanian restaurant was a popular destination on 5th Street. There were actually 3 kosher restaurants, as well as the central bakery for the Bogoslavsky Bakery, and the Hungarian synagogue was also on 5th Street. And this picture is the famous delicatessen at 4th and Bainbridge, still open, and people go there, and they count political results there, I'm told. It's one of all the candidates like to hang out there on election day. And this picture is Levis's Hot Dogs. It was a very famous, well-known hot dog establishment. You could get very limited menu. This is before my time. I've never was there, but you could get a hot dog or a fish cake or Champ cherry soda, was they were known for. They later moved to the suburbs. They were in Jenkintown, and I think the company exists, but I don't know if they have a retail store anymore. So that's just some examples of Jewish quarter businesses. We're going to move along to, oh my goodness, I'm looking at the time. We're going to kind of fly through. This is the Marshall Street area, which was similar to the Jewish quarter, but it was on the northern part of town, right? Marshall Street was a north-south street that ran between 6th and 7th and between Poplar and Girard in North Philadelphia. And it was similar to the Jewish quarter, but a little bit smaller. Many synagogues, businesses, push carts, and all kinds of things went on Marshall Street. My grandmother told me the story of going with her mother on the trolley to Marshall Street and bringing home a live fish in a bucket on the trolley to make gefilte fish. So there was a children's book called The Carp in the Bathtub. If you ever saw that book, at least according to my grandmother, that was true. People did that. This was the B'nai Halberstam Synagogue in that neighborhood at 6th and Fairmount. The building still stands. It's a church. And this was the Knesset Israel Anshe Sephard Synagogue right on Marshall Street. The building also still stands, but it's been renovated to a condominium. In the few years that I've been doing tours, as they call it, gentrification has kind of marched across parts of Philadelphia. Marshall Street 5 years ago was a mess, and today it's all being rebuilt and kind of new people coming in and cleaning up that part of the neighborhood. So this is what Marshall Street looked like in a heyday, and you can see the push carts in front of the stores. And this was a very famous restaurant called the Ambassador Restaurant at 7th and Girard, just around the corner from Marshall Street, that people talked about, having gone to a dairy restaurant where you could get whatever it was, blintzes or eggs or all kinds of fish, and they even, I'm told, they had like meat substitutes even before that was a popular thing. Interestingly, I was driving on Girard Avenue about a year ago, a little bit before the pandemic, and across the street from where this stood, there's another building, just a random building, and I noticed it had a sign called the Ambassador Tap Room. So somebody opened up a new, like a bar restaurant, and they named it after its former neighbor, the Ambassador. I thought that was kind of cool. So this was that AJ building that we saw earlier. Later was Ohel Jacob in that same neighborhood. We're going to talk about Second Settlement. I want to make sure we're good with time because we're kind of running. Can I tell you? Back to our Brewer map, and we're going to talk about some of these outer neighborhoods. I know we're definitely skipping West Philadelphia today. I'm sorry that this isn't going to be time, but I want to try to get us to the third settlement. So when we talk about second settlement, uh, we'll do, for example, Strawberry Mansion, but second settlement really is not just a Philadelphia thing, but in all, all cities. The sociologists tell us that's where, as the immigrants start to become a little bit prosperous and they can buy a house and they can get out of the immigrant ghetto, which is what they called it, the neighborhoods they go to are the second settlement. So it's Strawberry Mansion, it's Logan, it's West Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, they follow the trolley lines. So if the trolley line went there, and if they advertised to in the Jewish Exponent, and there were Jewish people knew that that was a place they could go, those were the second settlement Jewish neighborhoods. In most of them, they did not have the Landsman synagogues anymore. There were no more, or very few of the Anshe whatever synagogues, but they were mostly Orthodox synagogue with maybe one or two conservative and no reform. In Philadelphia, there's two reform synagogues for much of the period that we're talking about, only Knesset Israel and Rodef Shalom. Until the late 1930s, there starts to be a few other reform synagogues, and then maybe one in a neighborhood. What happens in the further neighborhoods is they all become all conservative synagogues. Philadelphia becomes known as this conservative movement city. So when we get to talk about Oxford Circle or West Oak Lane or Mount Airy, it's overwhelmingly conservative synagogues with maybe one or two Orthodox and maybe one Reform. So let's just talk about Strawberry Mansion a little bit. A lot of people went there from South Philadelphia. The trolley lines went there. It's kind of north and west of Center City. And its borders are kind of delineated by the park and by major streets and a railroad. At one time, there were said to be 50,000 Jews in Strawberry Mansion. And a little bit later period, after the Shoah in the late 1940s and 1950s, it was a first stop for many Holocaust survivors. That I guess they got to Philadelphia and they said, "Where do the Jews live?" And they were pointed to Strawberry Mansion. My dad told a story. We have his cousin was married to a woman, and her name was Charlotte. I don't know if anyone knows Charlotte. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I remember she had an accent, and I said one time to my father, I said, "Dad, where's Charlotte from? Because I know she has a European accent. Where's Charlotte from?" He says, "Strawberry Mansion." I thought that was kind of funny. So here's our Brewer map close up, and you can see those clear borders of the park and the railroad and Lehigh Avenue on the north. And across Lehigh Avenue were like cemeteries and big open fields. So there was no neighborhood there. But in these blue streets, right, 31st Street is a major shopping street, and 33rd is bordering the park with kind of big houses. And interspersed, we saw that Beth Israel. I think maybe we'll see it again. There's another synagogue called B'nai Jeshurun, a very large conservative synagogue, and then quite a number of smaller Orthodox synagogues. There's that Beth Israel again, a little bit closer up picture, and you can see that dome and those grand steps. And here's B'nai Jeshurun, as big, if not bigger. And you can see this motif above the door. It's kind of a menorah and a Star of David superimposed. And it must have been their logo or their icon. It's inside as well. I do have interior pictures of the B'nai Jeshurun building. There's one you can see where the ark was. The church now uses it for whatever their own purposes. But and you can read a little bit of the Hebrew. It's a little faint, but you can kind of see it behind the ark. This is a picture of the balcony, and you can see the inside of that window with the star. And it had very beautiful, and you can see the church has really maintained this. There's 6 large stained glass windows on each wall. Each one is about a holiday, and has a verse from the Torah associated with either Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shabbat, or Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. When I went there the first time to visit, the church lady who let me in, I said to her, "You have these beautiful windows." And she said, "Yes, we really admire them," but she didn't know anything about what the Hebrew meant. So I translated it for her, and she was very excited. They feel like they're preserving the heritage of the mother religion kind of thing, that they understand their Christian faith stems from Judaism, and preserving this synagogue building. And I've seen that in other churches that used to be synagogues around Philadelphia It's kind of nice and reassuring. Here's a ceiling picture. You can see that it's not in great shape. It needs some repairs, but you can see the star and that motif continued there. I thought that this was interesting. This chair was there with the carved menorah. There's no way the church bought that. The synagogue left that there, which I was kind of surprised they didn't take it. The congregation moved to Mount Airy in the 1960s, and I guess they didn't want to take the chair. All right, we'll talk about Logan a little bit. Logan is the second settlement neighborhood that really grew in the post World War I, but really in the 1920s, when the Broad Street subway was extended north and it reached Donnelly Avenue just beyond. The Jewish hospital, which is now known as Einstein, was already in that area, a little bit north of Logan. So there was already like a Jewish presence. There was also on the west side of Broad Street and a few blocks back, there was a Jewish orphan home that was in the area where LaSalle University is today. So there was some Jewish institutional presence a little beyond Logan. So when the Jews kind of discovered Logan, they thought that might be, a good place to settle. So it has a large conservative synagogue, Beth Shalom. Beth Judah was wavered between conservative and Orthodox for some decades, and there were a few Orthodox synagogues as well. In later years, as it became more of an Orthodox neighborhood, there was a mikveh, there was kosher shopping, and as people left Strawberry Mansion, many of them ended up in Logan before moving on to the Northeast. So it's just a general map to give you a sense of, so this is Broad Street, right, to the nexus at Cheltenham Avenue, and Logan is that first neighborhood just beyond the Roosevelt Expressway. If you get off the expressway on Broad Street, the first neighborhood you pass is Logan. And there's our Brewer map, and we can see how Jewish Logan was. If you're driving north on the boulevard, you don't get off at Broad Street, say, you keep going north, you might notice if you look out your left window that there isn't anything there. There's streets, but there aren't any houses for a number of blocks. And if you remember, or if you were around in Philadelphia in the 1980s, they were talking about the Logan houses sinking, that neighborhood was built in the 20s on like fill over a creek. And by the 80s, the houses were cracking and crumbling, and the city had to buy all their houses and tear them down. So it's kind of eerie, like a prairie with streets and no houses for much of what was Jewish Logan. But there's a little bit left that you can still see. This is the original Beth Shalom that still stands on Broad Street. Beth Shalom was the first synagogue to leave the city. In fact, they had a Hebrew school building by 1950 in Elkins Park, and they moved the synagogue when they built the Frank Lloyd Wright building in 1959. So they left the city before even some Jews left North Philadelphia for Logan. They had left altogether. Here's a drawing of the original Beth Shalom, and that was the interior. And you can see it was a pretty grand interior. This was the Beth Judah, which still stands on 11th Street. And there are two synagogues that were churches. This one was Rodef Tzedek, and this one was B'nai Israel. They started out as kind of mainline Protestant churches. Then they were synagogues, and today they're African-American congregations, kind of like reflecting who lived in the neighborhood. It's pretty typical for a American story, right? Let's see. So this was a little bit of the business district at 11th and Loudon. Much of the business district also was demolished in the city's efforts, but these stores remain. There's nothing Jewish about them anymore, but it's just like a little picture of what that once looked like. I remembered as a kid going to Rosen's Bakery on 11th Street, and people talk about the delis and the butchers, and typical of most of these second settlement neighborhoods, there were Jewish businesses that people came from all around to go their Jewish shopping, right? In Strawberry Mansion on 31st Street, or in Logan on 11th Street, or they went to South Philadelphia on 7th Street. And that was the old time Jewish shopping. I always include a picture of Central High School. It was for many decades. Anybody a Central graduate on our call? I imagine there probably are. For many, many decades, Central and Girls High School and Temple University were part of the Jewish path into the middle class. And I thought it was worth including a picture of Central High School here. We're going to actually skip through because I want to get a few minutes of the third settlement. So we're going to skip quickly. This was Brith Israel and Roosevelt Boulevard. And that's a neighborhood called Feltonville. This was the inside, and you can see they also have preserved a lot of the Jewish images inside their church. And this was across the street, was called B'nai Yitzchak, also in Feltonville, somewhat east of Logan. We're going to just quickly look at the picture of Har Zion and not talk so much about Winfield. Winfield was the wealthiest of the Russian Jewish immigrants as they left the ghettos. Winfield was the destination if they were the most prosperous. And Har Zion was the main synagogue of Winfield for a period of about 60 years until they left Winfield as well into Lower Merion Township. But it was not just prominent in Winfield and in Philadelphia, but Har Zion was really among the most prominent conservative congregations nationally. And I think that's important to point out. There was some scholarship indicated more conservative rabbis grew up at Har Zion than any other conservative, than any other synagogue, which my teacher, Dr. Saul Wax, disputes that. He thinks it was Kehillat Israel in Brookline, Massachusetts, but I don't know. It was in print that it was Har Zion. And it was Har Zion leaders that founded Solomon Schechter Day School, which is now Perlman, Akiba Hebrew Academy, which we know is now Barak, Camp Ramah in the Poconos, and other very important institutions of Jewish life, both in Israel and in America, all really came out of Har Zion leadership. I think that's important to mention. And there's a whole lot more story to be told about West Philadelphia and Winfield for another time. I want to get to third settlement. There we go. So third settlement of those neighborhoods on the edges of the city, right, where the returning veterans after the Second World War were able to buy an airlight row house from Corman or Orleans and have a driveway up the back and raise their baby boom kids in these neighborhoods. So in Philadelphia, we're talking about Oxford Circle and other parts of the Northeast. We're talking about Mount Airy and West Oak Lane. And in the western end, we're talking about Overbrook Park. And they're all very similar. They have their main shopping street, whether it's Haverford Avenue or Ogons Avenue or Castor Avenue. And they have, as I said, the plethora of conservative synagogues, right? We're going to see some pictures. And we'll focus on the Northeast. It's probably the most interesting to us today. So let's do so. This was a study of Jewish neighborhoods in 1970. So this is still in the heyday of the third settlement, and we can see some of the older sections. Logan, for example, or parts of Center City still had a very large percentage of Jewish people, but they're mostly older. And when we look at Oxford Circle, for example, they counted 27,000 Jewish adults, and realize in those days that was when there were 1,000 kids in a class at Northeast High School. Maybe even some people on this call were in those classes. So in those days, Oxford Circle was 85% Jewish. Someone shared with me a number of 100,000 Jews who lived south of Cotman Avenue in the Northeast in the 60s and 70s. So we're 27,000 adults. Is that plausible that with all the kids it's 100,000? I think it's plausible. I think they're pretty interesting numbers. You don't see that, that kind of concentration anywhere today, even in the heavily Jewish suburbs. You don't see those kind of numbers. So West Oak Lane and Mount Airy, the borders are a little fuzzy. I'm always not exactly sure what's what. You know that the area on the other side of Washington Lane going towards Cheltenham Avenue is Mount Airy, but there's parts that some people called it West Oak Lane, some called it East Mount Airy. It's here we go. That's the map that helps. So this area we know is West Oak Lane. This area is Mount Airy. It's this area over here around Wadsworth Avenue. This map calls it Cedar Brook. Other maps called it West Oak Lane, and all the people seem to call it Mount Airy. But Wadsworth Avenue was one of the shopping streets around here. And that was the neighborhood of the red brick row houses, very similar to Oxford Circle. We'll see some synagogue pictures now. This was Ezrath Israel at 69th and Ogons before they merged with Ner Tzedek on Bustleton Avenue. It was its own synagogue, Ezrath Israel. And this was the original building of Emmanuel, which moved a couple blocks away. This building still stands and it still has Jewish stars. It's an African-American church that has Jewish stuff, but they also have Jesus. So I don't know what they call that, African Israelite or something like that. Here's the second building of Emmanuel, and we've been inside here also. You can see they've maintained, as have some of the others, the beautiful stained glass and different features. There's the, of course, they have the cross, but you can see the ark and you can see the various biblical verses in Hebrew behind the ark. This is an interesting building called Ahavath Israel in West Oak Lane. It was designed by Louis Kahn, really a very prominent architect of his day, and it looks like a nothing. I don't know what it looked like inside, and I haven't been inside the church to see. But it was architecturally significant for its day. This was the third Reform congregation after Knesset Israel and Rodef Shalom. Temple Judea opens in the 1930s, all the way near the top of Broad Street, almost to Cheltenham Avenue. Today, it's an Asian senior center. And the Germantown Jewish Center, which is still functioning synagogue in Northwest Philadelphia. Well, most of the others have left for the suburbs or closed. So this was the original Temple Sinai, later moved to Drescher. And these are an assortment of other Mount Airy synagogues. This was Ramat El, the Mount Airy Jewish Center. This was B'nai Jeshurun. This was the Orthodox Ohav Tzedek. This one was the West Oak Lane Jewish Community Center. And this is the one Reform, Beth Or. And if the names are familiar, because they mostly moved to the suburbs. And you can see the twins and row houses look very much like other third settlement neighborhoods. Here, let's talk about the Northeast a little bit. And I think we'll probably conclude here and maybe not get to the suburbs. Today, we'll save it for another time. So the Northeast is, this enormous land section of Philadelphia that's mostly farms really until after the Second World War. And after the war, Corman and Orleans, the builders, build row upon row upon row of row houses. The further parts of the Northeast were more twins and single houses and more suburban, but the older part of the Oxford Circle and Ronhurst neighborhoods were these row houses and twins. The Jews mostly lived on the west side of Roosevelt Boulevard, and the east side, for whatever reason, were like ethnic Catholics, Irish and Polish and Italian people. Not very many Protestants, as I understand it. Most of the synagogues are conservative. We'll see some examples, and we have our Jewish shopping on Castor and Bustleton and also Cotman Avenue. And there are other Jewish institutions besides synagogues in the neighborhood, such as the Neighborhood Center, which was part of the JCCs. There were Jewish war veterans posts. There were various schools. So we'll see some examples. Here's our map, and we can see this section here was the Oxford Circle, older Northeast section, and this is the more suburban Bustleton and Somerton areas. Here we go. There's some row houses, not so different from Mount Airy, should look familiar to many people. And Temple Shalom was really the gateway to the Northeast synagogue. You saw it on the hill on Large Street. If you're driving north on Roosevelt Boulevard, it was up on the left. And the story goes that as Corman was building all these rows of houses, he was going to start a synagogue. He was Jewish. Both Corman and Orleans were Jewish. And Corman had it in his head, he's going to build a shul along with the neighborhood. So as he sold a house, he asked the people to give $100 in addition towards the fund of building of the synagogue. If you look at it, you can't tell from black and white, but it's a red brick building. It looks like it fits in with that Oxford Circle neighborhood. This is another of the main Northeast synagogues, the Oxford Circle Jewish Community Center, called by its initials OC, JCC. And here's the third large conservative synagogue, Beth Emeth, on Bustleton Avenue. There were smaller conservative independent synagogues and a few Orthodox in a later period. No real reform. There was a Boulevard Temple in Mayfair, which later moved to the far northeast and became Temple Beth Torah. But it's mostly, as we said before, mostly conservative synagogues are dominating the Northeast through much of the period. They've all closed at this point, all become either part of Sharei Shamayim or a part of suburban synagogues. I think that Adath Tikva in Ronhurst and Bell's Corner became part of Ohev Shalom a number of years ago. Correct me if I'm mistaken. So there's that continued migration, right, from the core of the city to the third settlement and then out to the suburbs. Let's see if we have some more. These are just a few other Northeast synagogues to share with you. This was the Young Israel of Oxford Circle. This was Adath Zion. Lubavitch Center still exists, right? This was Adath Tikva's building on the upper right. And the bottom right actually still exists. The Temple Menorah is in the east side of the boulevard in Mayfair. And it was there before all of the Oxford Circle synagogues, and it's been there since after all of the Oxford Circle synagogues. It's a kind of a unique situation that there's no Jewish neighborhood, but whatever Jews there are scattered around that area have been able to maintain that congregation. And here's some examples of some of our favorite Northeast shopping and delicacy kinds of places. I don't think Lipkin is still around, but Hesch's is a blessed memory, was our family's favorite go-to for chocolate chip cake and for various danishes. When I was 3 years old, I used to ask my grandma to take me to Jack's and the pickles in the bowl. And everybody loved the country club with the cheesecake and everything else. And of course, the Orleans movie and the Gimbals of the Great Northeast. These are just a few examples of the days of the Great Northeast. And no picture would be finished without talking about the transportation. So we have, of course, the Roosevelt Boulevard with the 12 lanes in each direction. It was really very important in linking the Northeast by car to the rest of the city, although the highway is probably not designed so great, and the news is talking about how to fix it. I don't know that they were for real, but the end of the L and all of the trolley and bus lines that took you to the L was another important link to the city. So here's a picture of the trackless trolley on Castor Avenue. I guess it's the 59 that would connect you to the Frankfurt terminal and take the L into town. So that's the story of the Northeast. We are actually not going to do the suburbs, but lest you think I was totally remiss, I want you to, we'll just fly through fast so you can see that I thought about the suburbs. And I got a picture of, there we go, okay? So eventually the Jews get to the suburbs, and you can invite me back another time and I'll tell you about, and here's your Ohev Shalom right there in the suburbs. We can do questions if you want. If you unmute, I'll stop the share. Let's see if I can. There we go. And if you're still with me and still alert, like some people chatted, maybe they're questions. Oh, somebody came from William Street. Thank you for sharing. I go places and people never heard of Jewtown.
Jewtown, my father was born there, and you showed the synagogue. My grandfather made the Star of David, which they put on top of the synagogue.
Okay.
Now, the thing is with Jewtown, it was a couple blocks long. It was William Street where he was born. And what it was, there was an immigration station for a short time right at Delaware Avenue where the boats came, and that's how my grandfather came to this country. And they settled on William Street. Now, the thing was, William Street was there was blacks living there since after the Civil War. So it was a multiracial community there.
And then it probably would have been more tolerant of the Jews than other ethnics.
Yeah, and the blacks still remain in that neighborhood.
Interesting. Yeah. My dad lived on Richmond Street,
right
above a shoe store, and the shul was whatever that is 6 blocks west in Jewtown. And he told me you had bar mitzvah lessons on Allegheny Avenue, but the shul, where they davened, where his bar mitzvah was in Jewtown. And he didn't know the name of it. He just said it was called Jewtown.
Yeah, there was 2 synagogues the small and the large. And when we used to go up Tulip Street, my father used to say, "That's the big shul and the little shul."
Okay.
Uh, my question: my grandmother lived at around 7th and Federal, and she worked when she was 17 years old. She worked at this big tobacco cigar company and had a big fire.
It's called Bayak Cigars.
No. This was down in South Philly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it was a terrible fire. About 10 people died. I was
Oh
wondering
my.
if you have any history on that, because
No, I
it
had
was,
not heard of that.
and when it was in the New York Times, even the story all over the country, and they referred to it as a neighborhood of Hebrews.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
The term Hebrew
Yeah.
was a 19th century term that they thought was politer than saying Jews.
Yeah, well, this was in 1902.
Okay, so it's a
Yeah.
leftover that all kinds of Jewish organizations were Union of American Hebrew Congregations, Hebrew Education Society. They all had the word Hebrew instead of Jewish because it was considered more polite. But another lady mentioned Bayuk cigars.
Yeah.
My very best friend from when I was born is a descendant of the Bayuk Cigar Company.
My mother used to work.
Michael, Ira has a question too. I see.
I see Ira Sharp has his hand up as being very polite. So thank you for raising hands. Maybe we all better do that to share. So
My mother worked at Bayak Cigars, and I went to the Talmud Torah at 3rd and 4th and Catherine.
okay, so there you go.
There I go. Yes.
Ira, go ahead with your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Wonderful talk. Just a comment, really. So I think most of us probably grew up in one of the neighborhoods that you've already mentioned. I don't know how many of us have grown up in the suburbs. And what I was impressed upon growing up myself in East Mount Airy was the fact that we had a cohesive Jewish community, that you could walk to synagogue and walk to school and walk to, as you mentioned, to the deli or whatever. And we've traded that for a suburban life, which granted is materially, I guess, nicer in some ways. But look what we've traded. We've traded material niceties, if you will, fine houses and big plots of land, and we've lost a sense of community.
Neighborhood, right. Yeah.
And that was my comment. I wonder how many of us, given the choice, would go back to a cohesive community such as we grew up in. That's all.
Thank you. I appreciate that. What I will share is that when we look today at the trends, the young people are staying in the city in walkable neighborhoods. Now, I don't know that they're living in Jewish neighborhoods. I think there's some that have more Jews than others, but there's nowhere, maybe Rittenhouse Square is more of a Jewish neighborhood, but there's nothing like the old days. It's probably too late, but that concept of walkable and of counting on neighbors and maybe it's coming back a little bit. But I would just reflect on is the idea of what makes a Jewish community. So in Mount Airy, so it was the synagogue, but it was also the stores and the deli and the Hebrew school and the friends and whatever. And in the suburbs, the synagogue becomes the community. So you need to, people that never joined the synagogue in the old neighborhood all join in the suburbs, whether it's conservative, reform, maybe Orthodox, because if you don't join the synagogue, you're not able to really be part of the community. So that's just a different thought. So there's another hand up that I saw, Cheryl.
Unmute, just unmute.
I didn't know that it was dairy, but he used to be able to clear a table for 16 in one trip.
What's that, the ambassador?
The ambassador,
Like,
yeah.
The plates all up and down his arm.
That's a good story. So I'm just looking at the chat. Somebody shared about grandparents at 33rd and Diamond, right by the park. So I took you may be familiar with the artist Mordechai Rosenstein. His work is probably hanging in your synagogue and maybe in some of your homes. So Mordechai is a good friend, and he grew up in Strawberry Mansion. So he took me on a tour, and we went for a drive around, and he showed me that was where the car barn was, where the trolleys turned around. And along that corner at 33rd and Diamond, there was an ice cream place called Cherries. And there was where they sold TVs. And if you didn't have a TV yet, you could watch it in the window. And Flomers was the other one he talked about. And then we went to the synagogue on Cumberland Street where Mordechai's bar mitzvah was. And the man drives up and says, oh, he's the president of the church and would we like to come in? So and he was so excited to meet a person who grew up there and had his bar mitzvah in that church. So we had a little tour inside what was called the Eitz Chaim Zichron Yaakov Synagogue on Cumberland Street. Let me see what else. Someone asked about Bingham Street. I did not live on Bingham Street. I have a cousin whose name is also Michael Schatz, and I forget where he grew up. I know he graduated from Cheltenham in the 70s, but he started in the Northeast. I lived in Dresher. Well, I guess I'm a wannabe. I don't know. We counted Dresher as part of Philadelphia. My parents came from Feltonville and later Ronhurst, and my dad came from Port Richmond. And when he was really little, he lived on 4th Street. We lived in Dresher, and now I live in Elkins Park, but I count as Philadelphia as far as I'm concerned. Ira, you asked privately, am I related to Dr. Nathan Schatz? So I happen to be the son of Dr. Nathan Schatz, the gastroenterologist. But I taught your kid at Gratz, I think, many years ago, Ira.
He's a neighbor of my brother's down in Florida.
Yeah, Valencia, one of them. Right?
Valencia Lakes, right?
That's the one. There's 10 Valencias, so that's, yes. Thanks for asking.
So
What else?
Hi.
Oh, Harriet F. has a question.
All right. So I'm typical, I guess. I was born in South Philly, so I'm 80. My grandparents, both sides, lived there. One grandparent set ended up in Oxford Circle, the other in Winfield. So my journey was South Philly, Overbrook, Winfield, and then Ronhurst, where I then lived after I got married. Then I lived out of the city for a while, and here I am back because basically I'm a Philly girl. So I think that, and I'm 3rd generation, so that means my grandparents were born here in America. So they started at around 4th and American, I believe. I've heard that story about that being a little Jewish enclave there. So, but I do remember I had cousins who lived in Strawberry Mansion. I remember visiting them there. And I thought when we lived in Winfield, that coming out to Oxford Circle was the other end of the world. We had to go through, I think, the park and then on the boulevard, and it just seemed like we rode and rode and rode.
And that's what my grandmother said about Winfield. Coming from the Northeast, Winfield's the other side of the world. And when we were kids in USY, my friends lived in Broomall. Before they built the Blue Route, Broomall was the other side of the world.
Yeah.
It took an hour to get there before the Blue Route.
Yep, it did. Yeah.
All right, who has a question? Is that Roberta has a hand up?
yeah, so I was told that my grandparents had a dry goods store at 938 North 2nd Street.
Mhm.
So I think that was like a little Jewish enclave
It was,
also.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Northern Liberties, they talk about today, right? It's a very hot neighborhood with where what's called the brewery used to be, and it's this whole thing. And restaurants on
Town,
2nd
right,
Street are
yeah.
very expensive. But at the turn of the 20th century, Northern Liberties was the neighborhood just north of Center City. And it really extended from the river all the way almost to Broad Street, really, or to the train tracks that are around 10th Street. And there were very close to the river on 2nd Street, on a street called Newmarket Street, which ran between Front and 2nd, were synagogues and immigrant Jewish areas. There's still a bakery at 3rd and Poplar. The Kaplan Bakery is still there.
Wow.
And then the neighborhood moved a little bit further west to where Marshall Street is, as I think I said, which runs
Marshall.
north-south
Yeah.
between 6th and 7th. And then across 7th Street was Franklin Street. And along Franklin Street, there was they called it the Maishav Skanim. Is that name familiar to anyone? The old folks' home, right? The Uptown home, which is on Bustleton Avenue, started out on Franklin Street.
Okay.
And and there was a Talmud Torah on Franklin Street. So that area was, the wider area was certainly had many Jews, and there were concentrations, as you said, along that New Market Street and close to the river, and then particularly along Marshall Street.
Right.
What else? I love hearing stories about the stores. I think that's Ira, what you were saying before about what you lose from the neighborhood. That's something that's very different. How many of you all, or of your peers, or of your kids certainly, like, own a retail store? That's not as common an occupation anymore. It was a hard life, and the grandparents did it, right? My one side had a shoe store, the other side had a meat wholesale business. And it was a very, very hard life. They didn't want that for their kids. They wanted to be professionals. But, what was lost is that strip, even when I was a kid and you went to Castor Avenue, all the stores were owned by Jews. Wadsworth Avenue, Ogons Avenue, same, all the more so. Some of the same stores, right? I found an ad not long ago for Sailor's butter and egg store. And they had them all over Philadelphia. And you could see from this ad, where were the Jewish neighborhoods? Because they had one on
Wyoming
7th
Avenue
Street.
across the street.
They had it everywhere.
And they delivered. They
They-
delivered butter and eggs. Yeah.
So you can see like those patterns of the stores that moved from 7th Street to 31st Street, and then from there to Ogons Avenue or whatever. And that's a very important piece of American Jewish history that I don't know if anyone's chronicled that yet. People have chronicled whatever, synagogues and all the things. I don't know about that Jewish business neighborhood kind of thing. Maybe I'll write that book one day.
Have a book
I
called-
see a
that's
Harvey
called-
Cantor. Is that a question?
Yeah, there's a series of books put out. I forget the name of the company. I have them all, of Philadelphia Jewish communities.
Right.
You talking about this one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have,
Right.
Yes, I have
So
well,
this
I have
guy-
like 30 of their books.
Oh, someone else has the South Philadelphia.
Yeah. So anyway,
I'm in it. I am in this book.
West Philadelphia, we lived on 52nd Street and all the stores up and down 52nd Street. Then you had, I think, 56th Street and then 60th Street.
Right.
And they all were where the Market Street L had a station.
Right.
And that's how those areas, the Jews came to those areas, because nobody had a car. They all took public transportation. And this is before shopping centers. And kids
That's right.
don't know what it was like to shop along the avenues, they would say. But
Right.
my
Depending on your
question-
neighborhood is, what did you mean by the avenue?
Well, different.
Right. Which avenue?
Yeah.
Wadsworth Avenue.
You could just
Right.
fill it in, Castor Avenue, 52nd Street, where I lived. I lived on Wyoming Avenue. We had a Sailors across the street, and then
Mhm.
Boguslavsky's.
Oh, God. Yes.
Bogies.
Yeah.
All right.
Bogies.
The
They
thing
were-
is, I wanted to ask you, what about the cemeteries?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah,
I-
because
I know a bit about them. I haven't done any tours there really.
Yeah.
I was on a call the other day, and maybe someone here was on it. There's a project from the Federation to kind of clean up the problems
I
at
saw
the
that.
Harnebo Cemetery.
that's where
where-
my
Yeah, I
that's
saw
where
that,
my
yeah.
grandparents are buried. I'm very concerned about that.
So yeah, it's an issue. Part of the issue, I believe, is that in Philadelphia, all the cemeteries are owned privately,
Yeah.
whereas in smaller communities, they're owned by the synagogue. So a synagogue has a vested interest in maintaining the cemetery. If there are no burials at Mount Carmel Cemetery and there's no income, whatever money they had from perpetual care is gone, and nobody's taking care, it's really a shame. But I'm glad that someone is taking a look. And I was on this call, as I said, with the Federation. I don't know how they're going to raise enough money. It's a tremendous amount that's needed. I know we had to pay to fix my great grandparents' stone. It was starting to lean, and it was perpetual care, and they should have done it, but they said, no, it doesn't cover. So it cost us a few $100s to fix it. But if everybody goes and checks and pays, but they're not going to do that. A lot of people aren't even around.
That's true.
Why were the cemeteries so far out?
They were supposed
Because
to
they
be.
weren't supposed to. I worked at a cemetery. I worked at Roosevelt. The cemeteries were not supposed to be in
Mm.
Jewish neighborhoods.
Right.
You were supposed to travel to get there.
Outside the city.
So
Yeah.
interestingly, when
No,
I
there's some in Philadelphia.
Yeah, but
When
at
I
that
showed
time, they
the-
weren't. They were
Yeah.
outside that limit.
when I
No,
showed
and down
the
in
slide,
Frankfurt, it's one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries.
Out of
That's the
Jefferson.
one where all the monuments
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
knocked down. That was
when I
in
showed the
Frankfurt.
slide, sorry, I'll tell you, when I showed the slide of one of the first ones of the Mikveh Israel Cemetery at 8th and Spruce, we think today that's in the middle of Center City. Well, guess what? In 1780, that
That
was
was-
on the edge of the city, right?
Exactly.
You go to the churches, they built the graveyard next to the church. But
Yes.
you're exactly right. The cemeteries were built outside the
Outside the
built-up
city.
area. But of course, then the city grows around them.
Yeah.
So certainly we've grown around 8th and Spruce. Mikveh Israel had a second cemetery at 10th and Federal, which of course has grown around. They had a third one at 55th and Market, right?
Yeah.
And they built cemeteries at the end of trolley lines, right? So it's outside the built-up area. So you get the cemeteries in Frankfurt and the ones down in Delaware County, because you could get there on the trolley, but it was outside the built-up area. So there's your answer. But
That was traditional, yeah.
that's why it's far. And the other reason is why no one's taking care of them, but it's whatever. It's our responsibility. We'll do the best we can. There are some very interesting things. I've taken people into that 8th and Spruce Mikveh Israel Cemetery. In the summertime, they open it. The rest of the year, you have to get a special permission. And the 55th and Market Cemetery has, you can see it from the street. Even if you can't get in, it has a big marker in memory of Isaac Leeser, who was probably the most important American Jew of the 19th century. And you can invite me back. I'll do a thing on Isaac Leeser. He's a fascinating individual. Almost every institution of American Jewish life today is here because of Isaac Leeser, and you never heard of him.
Never heard of him.
Hmm.
But
Well,
he's
come
buried
on
at
back.
55th and Market. Let's do one more question. It's almost 9. Anyone have one more? We got it all. I'm just looking at, somebody wrote about Ogons Avenue in West Mount Airy, Castor Pharmacy, Queen Village, and Mount Sinai Hospital. I have this Facebook page, which I think was mentioned. If you want to follow me, or it's called Philly Jewish History. You can find that on Facebook. And when I posted about Mount Sinai Hospital in South Philadelphia, I had more comments than any other post that I've ever made. Hundreds of people wrote, I was born there, I worked there, my this and that. And it was really quite interesting. So somebody
Michael?
posted that. Yeah,
Michael?
last one.
Yeah, about 4 years ago or so, the Center City Kahila, they had a very interesting tour. It was a bicycle tour of the synagogues.
Uh-huh.
And so we covered a lot more territory than you could maybe in the walking tour. And we found it very fascinating to see things. And when synagogue was turned into like a Baptist church, and the Reverend, whatever, he came out and then he talked to us for a little bit. But it's amazing to see how many buildings were synagogues at one time, and now they're other institutions.
It's really quite a fascinating history, if you ask me. And I think it's better than New York, although the New Yorkers might disagree. They seem to tear things down, and we try to preserve them. And particularly in the Jewish Quarter in South Philadelphia, more things are preserved. But even other places, there's things there to see. And I look forward to the time that we can all get together and take a walking tour. So thank you again for having me. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me.
Thank you,
And it's been a
Michael.
pleasure to learn with all of you.
Wonderful. And
Thank you, Michael.
next
Thank you.
year, we are definitely hoping to have a bus tour and perhaps one of the other particular topics that we'll talk about. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Michael.
much.